So don't want to waste too much time. So we can go ahead and get started. But I know folks are still coming in. But yeah, we will dive into this. So thanks everyone for joining our briefing, Billions for Bombs, Pennies for the People. We Build Progress is co-hosting this briefing with Public Citizen, so we thank them for that collaboration. My name is Maria Malik. I lead the foreign policy program at We Build Progress. We are a 501c3 nonprofit that works to identify and build solidarity around policies that foster a more just, equitable, and resilient nation. And we have a lot of policy analysis, explainers, trainings, briefings, technical assistance that we provide to help folks out. So feel free to check out our website and get involved. So for our briefing, we're going to dive into our federal budget. Every year, Congress and the White House, they add hundreds of billions of dollars to the war budget, while they underfund healthcare, food assistance, clean water, housing, education, and many other basic everyday needs. So right now, the budget for the Pentagon is a $1 trillion budget. As we speak this month, Congress is about to vote on a record-breaking $1.5 trillion budget. So they're about to add 500 billion more in just 1 year. Again, at a time when housing, healthcare, and a lot of other human needs are underfunded. So we are going to share information that you need to know ahead of the key vote on the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, that should be coming for a vote in the coming weeks. We'll talk about how corporate greed drives our militarized budget, the real life impacts, and where we could fund our communities instead. And we'll also talk about next steps on how we can oppose this egregious war spending. So just a few housekeeping items. On my end, as I mentioned before, We Build Progress is a 501c3 organization. We work exclusively on policy change, so we will be digging deep into policy discussions today, but we will not be focusing on elections or partisan politics. We Build Progress is an independent nonprofit organization, and we're not affiliated with any member of Congress. Second, we have automatic closed captioning enabled. So if you need to turn them on, you can go to the meeting controls at the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, click on captions and then show captions, and you should be all set. And then third, we are going to end today's discussion with some Q&A for our panelists. So you can drop your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. As we go through the briefing, just feel free to drop in questions, or you can wait till the end. And yeah, we will try to get to as many as we can. So yeah, thanks for joining. Thanks to our panelists. And I'm going to start with Bill Hartong. Bill is a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He is an expert on arms industry and the U.S. military budget. He was previously the director of the Arms and Security Program at the Center for International Policy. Bill is a co-author with his Quincy colleague Ben Freeman on a recently released book, The $1 Trillion War Machine: How Runaway Military Spending Drives America into Forever Wars and Bankrupts Us at Home. And he's also written numerous other books on the Pentagon budget, defense contractors profiting off of the military industrial complex, and much more. Great to have you here, Bill. So can you start by setting the scene for us a bit and talk about what is being funded in this massive 1 trillion to 1.5 trillion war budget, and is all this really serving the public?
It's a lot of money and it's not serving us. Um, well, thank you, Miriam, and thanks to Public Citizen and We Build Progress. I see a lot of friends and colleagues participating, but also a lot of folks I don't know, which is how it's supposed to work because we're building a movement. And I'm honored to be with Savannah, Naveed, Lindsay, Miriam. I can't imagine a team I could be prouder to be a part of. And if we look tired, it's because a lot of work to do. Um, but anyway, $1.5 trillion is kind of like a fantasy for Pentagon contractors. And, to increase the Pentagon budget to $500 billion in 1 year, that's larger than the whole annual military budget of any country in the world. So the addition is about 60% more than what China spends in a year. And it's not possible to spend it effectively. They don't have the factories, they don't have the skilled workers. They might as well just Venmo it straight to Palantir and Lockheed Martin and get it over with so they can bid up their stock prices and pay their CEOs $20 million a year, which they will certainly do. Um, but as for the allocations, there's a lot of money going into Golden Dome, which is a confidence scheme, which has been revived by Donald Trump. Back in the 80s, when President Reagan gave his Star Wars speech, he promised a perfect leak-proof defense against intercontinental ballistic missiles. So more than 40 years later, not only has that not been proven, they haven't even done a realistic test. And any scientist or physicist who's not on the payroll of an arms company or the Pentagon will tell you it's not possible to have a leak-proof defense. And yet, they claim they want to try to do it. And as the conservative American Enterprise Institute estimates, they could blow us up into the trillions of dollars trying and failing to do that. And it will be good news for Lockheed Martin and Palantir and SpaceX. I had the honor of being attacked by Palmer Luckey, the head of Anduril. He's a gamer who decided to start making weapons and thinks he should run our foreign policy. He said I was a shill. I'm like, what am I shill for? The peace? What are you talking about? But anyway, one of the things he has said is that we could cut the Pentagon budget in half if we stopped buying the wrong things. So I took him up on his proposition. I wrote a column for Forbes. I said, well, certainly one of the wrong things is Golden Dome because it's impossible. It's a waste of money. So I assume, Mr. Lucky, if I may call you Mr. Lucky, you're not going to take any money on that, right? I mean, because you don't want to buy things that we don't need. So anyway, I haven't heard from him, but I'm not holding my breath. And then, of course, there's the quadrupling our artillery production. And they're making headway on that. General Motors is going to collaborate with one of the big weapons contractors to make their capabilities available to make components for artillery. And they've made a big deal about having an artillery and missile shortage. Well, if you're going to subsidize genocide in Gaza and ethnic cleansing and occupation in Lebanon and fight an illegal, unnecessary war against Iran and supply Ukraine to defend itself, yes, you will be short on munitions, especially since the US munitions cost in the millions or more, and the things they're trying to shoot down cost in the tens of thousands. So if you're concerned about a munitions shortage, don't subsidize genocide, don't fight stupid wars, have an actual defense strategy that's about defense. Because otherwise they're going to expand the size of our arms industry. And once you build the factories, they don't want to ever shut them down because then there's more jobs in the districts of members and it gets locked in and we get a narrower and narrower, narrower ability to do anything else. We quote Eisenhower liberally in our book. But one thing he said was, defense really means you need a well-educated population, you need a healthy population. People need to have some unity about what they stand for. We can't let corporations determine our defense policy or our budget. Well, none of that is happening now. It's the exact opposite. We've whittled down to where, we've destroyed the Agency for National Development, not we, but the DOGE process. So basically, all the bets are on the military. And to quote Karl Marx, could have been Groucho, but history happens first as tragedy and then as farce. Well, this war with Iran would be a farce if so many people weren't being hurt in Iran and Lebanon. They don't even bother to justify it. There's no ginning up white papers. There's no bullying the intelligence community to write fake, assessments. They just did it. And when Donald Trump was asked by a reporter, about to get on a plane, but you said we obliterated their nuclear program last year. And then you said they could threaten us. How could that be? You said, well, there might be something buried down there in the rubble, like, one warhead. Well, if there was, they would also have to miniaturize it, attach it to a missile, build a missile that went 6,000 miles to be able to threaten the United States. And of course, we had an agreement that was working with them, that was blocking their path to a bomb. And Donald Trump ripped it up, said he could do better. His idea of better is a region-wide war in the Middle East. So we've got a lot to work with, but also I think Congress is starting finally to rise to the occasion. Voting against the NDAA, amendments to cut the part that's coming through the regular Pentagon budget, attempts to block the part that's going to come through the special reconciliation process. So I think we have a good chance of blocking a good portion of the 500 billion, but they may still end up with an increase because they propose so much. But I think this has to be the beginning of Congress saying we're not just going to accept what the Pentagon sends down here. And we're certainly not going to, which unfortunately we've done in the past, add things to the budget beyond what the Pentagon asked for, or block them from getting rid of things because of pork barrel politics in our states or districts. And I think, it's a much wider issue now. I mean, we had, Savannah can speak to this, but a large number of organizations have signed on against this increase across many different issue areas because it's eating into the underlying basis of our society. I mean, they spent more in the first week of the war in Iran than Trump would want to spend on the Environmental Protection Agency and the Centers for Disease Control for a whole year. So climate, which is upon us, that crisis, or pandemics, which have killed more people than the wars of the last 100 years, are being completely neglected to line the pockets, not just of Lockheed Martin, but of Palantir, which of course groomed our wonderful Vice President J.D. Vance for his current role. So yeah, on the one hand, it's almost like to me it's like the end of an era. They're sort of lashing out with all the bad ideas that they've had all these years. They're doubling down on them, and people are starting to realize that the emperor has no clothes, and that we cannot accept this if we want to have a functioning society. So I think what's missing now is people's sense of their own power. A lot of people feel like they can't really make a difference. I'm just going to hunker down in my community, my family. Well, that's not an option anymore because what they're doing to our budget, what they're doing with the wars, what they're doing here at home, there is no neutral ground anymore. And I think once people realize that and realize that they do have power, we're going to be able to turn this thing around. I'm so thankful to people who've been working on this so hard when we didn't have this kind of visibility that we have now.
Right, absolutely. Thanks, Bill. And we'll get into this more later. But since you brought up Iran, I mean, there seems to be a ceasefire deal in place to end a war. We'll see. But before all that, Congress and the White House were even considering possibly an Iran supplemental bill, which would add more money to war spending, to defense contractors. Just to fund a war in Iran, which would be separate from this entire $1 trillion budget. So that, but I mean, now it might not happen. I don't know with this agreement. We'll have to wait and see. But our lawmakers are always trying to find other ways outside this massive budget to add more. So that it's something to keep an eye on and work and organize around. But yeah, thank you, Bill. Okay, I'm going to turn it over now to Lindsay Kashgarian. Lindsay is the program director of the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. Her work on federal budget priorities highlights the militarization of the federal budget and the corresponding lack of investment in people and the planet. Her published reports include analysis of militarization in the federal budget from the Pentagon and the war to militarization to US borders and militarization of law enforcement. So yeah, thank you, Lindsay, for joining. As we laid out already, the Pentagon gets hundreds of billions of dollars more every year, but can you backtrack a little bit and remind us how Congress added to the war budget last year?
Yeah, definitely, Miriam. So, first of all, it's not unusual for Congress to add to the war budget, but we're really seeing such a departure in terms of the scale. And I just want to remind us all that we've heard the priorities from Trump on this pretty straight. He said a little while ago that, we can't afford things like childcare because we're fighting wars, right? And then he said that no, he doesn't think about Americans' financial situation when he's trying to end the Iran war. Why would he think about that? So he's being very upfront about what his priorities are. But we're seeing that consistently in the legislation too. So this year we're facing this $1.5 trillion budget that Trump has requested. But just last year we had our first $1 trillion budget. So we're just breaking record after record here. And the way that we got to the $1 trillion budget last year was through a reconciliation package. Which the significant thing about that folks may know on the call is that it does not have a filibuster in the Senate. It just requires a simple majority vote so it can pass along party lines. And that's exactly what happened. So last year they passed the big bad bill, the big ugly bill, and it included $156 billion for the Pentagon. Now, that was supposed to originally last multiple years. They were going to spend that money over a period of several years. It was going to do a bunch of the things that they wanted to do, Golden Dome and other bad ideas that Bill talked about. But it was not supposed to just go away. And what happened instead is that they said, oh no, we want all of that money for 1 year, and now we're going to come back and ask for 1.5 trillion. So, first of all, either extremely bad planning or disingenuousness and lying or both. In terms of what the future budget is going to look like. And we should really think about that as we face this 1.5 trillion too, because wherever it lands this year, historically, the Pentagon budget does not go down. It usually only goes up. And so if we land wherever we land, that's sort of setting the new benchmark for where we may be. And that's what happened with the $1 trillion, with the 156 billion that was added last year. So now they said they're putting it all in this current fiscal year, fiscal 2026. It's not even probably going to be spent this fiscal year. We know by sort of their track record of spending it so far that they're actually not able to spend it as fast as it's coming in at this rate, and that will only get worse if they get this 1.5 trillion or any significant part of the 1.5 trillion that they're asking for. As an example of that, last September, the Pentagon spent $93 billion in a single month, including people may have heard about on lobster and steak feasts at the Pentagon. That amount of money, so $93 billion for the Pentagon in September. Just a month later, we had a government shutdown where SNAP, food stamps benefits, shut down for people. That program costs only a little more than that for an entire year. So these are the priorities that we're seeing is that the Pentagon has more than it can possibly spend, while food stamps runs out of money because we have some disagreement over federal spending. Um, on that note, the other major thing that that reconciliation big bad bill last year did was cut Medicaid and food stamps. And it cut by the tune of about over $900 billion, almost $1 trillion over 10 years for Medicaid, and it cut almost $200 billion over 10 years for SNAP. And the result of that will be, and already is, millions of people losing their food stamps benefits at a time of historically high grocery prices, especially due to the Iran war. And then also millions of people losing their Medicaid health insurance. And actually, the worst of that or hasn't even come close to hitting us yet because it'll take place this fall. So there's lots of people who will suffer as a result of this bill. And where it put the money, it took the money from Medicaid and SNAP and put it straight into the Pentagon and straight into mass deportations. So that was a direct sort of, we're taking the money from here and we're going to put it over there. And that's exactly what they want to do again this year with the next big bad bill that they're proposing that probably would include further cuts to Medicaid and SNAP and probably $350 billion more for the Pentagon. So they're trying to pull the exact same thing again, and we just shouldn't fall for it, especially since we know that they absolutely don't need this money.
Thank you, Lindsay. Really appreciate that overview. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Savannah now. Savannah Wooten. She is a human rights organizer with a background in conflict resolution and atrocity prevention. She is currently the People Over Pentagon advocate at Public Citizen and leading a coalition campaign to cut excess spending on weapons, waste, and war and relocate federal funds back into human needs priorities. And she'll probably get into that more, but also winning this coalition work, we've got some great progress made in Congress as well that hasn't happened in many years. So Savannah has been doing great work. Yeah, so Lindsay just kind of explained what happened last year to get us to this massive top line of 1 trillion this year and opening up a space to even discuss a $1.5 trillion budget, which is crazy. Um, can you talk about other vehicles that Congress is considering to fund more war?
Yeah, I can. And thank you to everyone who's on the panel and you, Miriam. And I particularly love going behind Bill and Lindsay because they frame the issue so poignantly. And I'm always like reminded why we do this work. So it's a real honor to go behind those two. Um, yes, so we have kind of an anomalous, actually an utterly anomalous year in terms of the way Pentagon spending is being requested and all of the different vehicles for requesting that spending. So, a lot of folks, I will gamble, who are on this call are aware that earlier in the year, at the onset of the Iran war, there was on top of, all of the additional vehicles and the amount that was added to our $1 trillion now Pentagon budget last year, there was conversation about that not being enough. And Hegseth and President Trump essentially indicated that they wanted to request, first tens of billions and then hundreds of billions in additional spending for a Pentagon, a supplemental war funding package. So this would be something that is outside of regular order, but would specifically be to fund the war effort with Iran. This was seeming imminent earlier this year. So, around March, April timeline, it seemed like that was something that was going to go through, or at least was going to get put into more tangible relief. Around that same time, we got, the full president budget request, which had this 1-2 step proposal. So not only the $1.15 trillion Pentagon base budget, but also a proposal that, somewhere from 300 to 350 billion in additional spending would be included in a reconciliation package, much like last year. So some of this is, repeating what Lindsay and Bill have said, but essentially, when we're thinking about this, we have to think about three different areas of Pentagon spending that we need to be like stemming the flow of and getting in the way of. It's this Iran, supplemental package, which is a very specific, piece of legislation that might move on its own, but would be very significant amount of money. It's the base budget itself, which is, the regular way that all federal spending, moves through the base budget. And then there's the threat of reconciliation, which is this, unique package that might move on its own along party lines. So we're looking at all of those three areas, but something that we've really been insisting that advocates make clear when they have conversations around this budget is it's not enough to just oppose one of those packages. They are actually designed to get this astronomical 1.5 trillion and maybe even higher than that sum by all going through in separate avenues. So when we're looking at resisting, we need to be talking about all of the different ways that they're angling to plus up this money, and it would, double or more the Pentagon budget over, the last 2 calendar years. And I think we need to be cognizant of how sharp of an increase that is when we've already been, the leading country in military spending by far for years and years and years, dwarfing at least last year the last 9 countries, the next 9 countries combined. I think if this money goes through, it's you know, much, much more than that. So yeah, lots of different areas where that funding is going through. But also, I will add, as part of my remarks, a lot of room for optimism in terms of defeating this thing being the Pentagon budget writ large, but all of the different individual packages. It's hard to cause an effect on some of this stuff, but I would hazard a guess, or I would put my, estimate on the fact that the supplemental package for Iran did not come out earlier in the year because there was such public outcry around it. So we saw for the first time, not the first time, but maybe the first time in like public consciousness or like breaking through to a broader audience, people really saying, no, I don't want that money going to war. I want it going to XYZ thing that we could have instead. Very much the same, kind of arguments that Lindsay and the National Priorities Project make all the time, but basically saying, I would rather have healthcare. I would rather have education. I would rather have, a solid and well invested livelihood for all of my community members. And so that was supposed to imminently come out, was supposed to have, a fixed dollar amount on it, and then didn't. They've now, I think re-raised that conversation, and they've been talking, in the last 2 weeks about, in addition to, conversations about a deal, there have still been conversations about a supplemental or needing to like replenish funding that they, supposedly spent on this war effort. So I think we need to be vigilant about that, but I think there's reason to believe that our vocal opposition is really working. And similarly, this is the last thing I'll say before handing it back to you, Miriam. There are efforts in almost every committee that deals with Pentagon spending right now to oppose the Pentagon budget, just the sheer number of it. So we saw the House Armed Services Committee had an amendment that would strip 150 billion out of the Pentagon top line. That's the first time we've had something like that in committee. Then we saw the exact same effort on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Those are committees that are very hard to get to take stances against the spending that they themselves are authorizing. So it's a huge victory, I think, wouldn't have happened if not for, vocal, advocates really like speaking up on this issue and saying enough is enough. And I think we're bound to see that type of resistance from new members of Congress, and advocates as we go further into the spending cycle. So not all is lost. In fact, a lot is gaining traction on our side of the issue too, and we should, hold that close to our hearts and keep pushing.
Thanks, Savannah. Yeah, I do want to just underscore that point because there's a lot of HASC and SAS members who previously have just been very, very supportive of any plus ups to the Pentagon, voting in favor of more spending, voting in favor of the NDAA, even, and ones that like just a few years ago would say the most supportive stuff in favor of war spending. But this year voted against any increase, which is a huge shift very quickly because as Savannah said, I think folks are seeing the reality of just their everyday lives, but the world that we're funding so much for war in 2 seconds. But if people need funding for SNAP or housing or Medicare, it's a whole battle in Washington, D.C. and around the world and in local legislatures. But yeah, I think folks are raising that and we're seeing the change as well. Yeah, thanks, Savannah. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it to Naveed Shah. Naveed is an Army veteran who served in Iraq and is currently the political director of Common Defense, a grassroots veterans organization which focuses on foreign policy, national security, democracy, and climate justice. So let's switch focus a bit now and talk about veterans. I want to note, so this massive budget, we're talking about $1 trillion currently, $1.5 trillion being considered right now. It does not include funding for veterans, the VA, housing assistance, medical care, education benefits, all other assistance for our veterans that is funded separately. That's part of the non-discretionary budget. So that's looped in with like housing and healthcare and all that other stuff. Um, so yeah, Naveed, could you talk about how this massive war budget, does it help those who actually serve in America's forever wars? And how might the government use its resources to improve veterans care at the VA and elsewhere?
Thanks so much, Miriam, and great to see you all here today. Thanks so much, my colleagues, Bill and Lindsay and Savannah, for being here too. I, really appreciate all the insight that you all have shared as well. To get to your question, Miriam, the VA is funded like on a completely separate line, right? Like medical care, disability compensation, housing support, mental health support, the community clinics that veterans rely on, the education benefits. None of that is in the Pentagon's budget, right? The Pentagon's budget and the VA's budget are actually sometimes in competition with each other for political attention in very different ways. Like the VA has groups like Common Defense and the Legion and the VFW that try to advocate for different issues. The Pentagon has an entire lobby of defense contractors and others who are constantly looking for ways that they can go back to the Pentagon and get whatever they can out of it. Um, so right, like for what we're facing right now, I'll give you a great example of this happening that's this week. Um, right now, Congress is considering a 600-page bill called the Take Care of America's Veterans Act, TACAVA, we'll call it for short. Includes the Major Richard Starr Act, which fixes concurrent disability compensation for retirement pay for medically retired veterans, which is about 60,000 people right now. And it's a real injustice, and this bill should fix it. And a lot of veterans groups have been advocating for this bill for a long time, the Major Richard Starr Act. However, what Takava does is it pays for the Major Richard Starr Act by cutting disability benefits for as many as 1.5 million veterans and all future veterans. It does this by making it so that tinnitus, hearing loss or hearing damage, and sleep apnea issues that can arise from being exposed to toxins like burn pits, loud machinery, combat stress, blast exposure, all of those things are off the table. And the VA's own analysis says that this would reduce disability compensation payments by $57 billion over the next decade. If they pass this bill, this would be the first time that Congress has ever cut earned disability benefits to offset the cost of something else. The reason that they are saying there's no other way to pay for this is why I'm here today. Because they're not saving this money. It's being spent elsewhere, as we're talking about. The Pentagon's own comptroller told us that in the first 6 days of the Iran war, they spent over $11 billion dollars. The entire Register Act would cost $10 billion dollars if they wanted to fix it right now. So one group of veterans did not need to pay for another group's benefits. Congress has just decided that they're going to let the war machine get funded, and the veterans who actually fight in that war machine can just come home and beg for scraps. So I'll pause there.
No, thank you, Naveed. Very important perspective here. So I'm gonna stick with you, and can you talk about the public opinion among veterans on the Pentagon budget, and in particular the wars that it's currently funding?
Yeah, absolutely. Veterans are not a monolith. I will say that up front. That's one of the reasons common defense exists, is because we know that there are veterans who are on every corner of the political spectrum. Um, but early polling had showed that veterans and military folks were broadly supportive of the Iran strikes. I think Fox News had it at like 59% at the time that the operation started. And I think a lot of that has to do with just being you know, patriotic and wanting to support our fellow troops who are in the middle of that. But public support for this war has since collapsed. The latest Ipsos poll has 53% of Americans saying it was just not worth it. 60% disapprove of how Trump has handled it. And the House passed a bipartisan war powers resolution, thanks in some part, I would hope, to veterans groups like ours speaking up and saying we don't want to continue this conflict. The veterans I work with at Common Defense are part of a growing tradition from the Vietnam era to the Gulf War to the Iraq veterans against the war, of people who wore the uniform and came home and said, "This is not what we signed up for. This is not, we did not enlist to be props for wars that Congress never voted on. We did not come home missing pieces of ourselves so that another contractor could land another billion-dollar contract." Um, and I think, just to kind of tie this together, like the question is never, can we afford to take care of our veterans, right? If we're asking for a $1.5 trillion defense budget, I think we can afford it. The question is whether Congress is willing to stop writing blank checks for wars that nobody authorized, nobody approved, the people don't want, or are they going to keep the promises to their voters, their constituents, including veterans in the military community? So can we afford to take care of our veterans? I would say we can't afford not to.
Thanks, Naveed. And I will like very quickly flag, not related to veterans though, but someone in our coalition, Stephen Semler, he did some analysis showing public support or public lack of support for the Iran war. And it found that wars usually start kind of popular-ish, but then they get unpopular over time. But this Iran war is the only one that started with negative 30% of the public in favor of it. And it just got even less popular from there. That was in February. So I can drop a link to that analysis as well, or share that afterward. Actually, yeah, for folks who registered, we'll be sending up a follow-up email with links and resources and recording of this as well. So I will share that there. But yeah, thank you, Naveed. Gonna turn it now back to Bill. And can you talk about who is profiting off of the war budget? Is it actually protecting our quote unquote interests or corporate interests?
Well, you mentioned Stephen Semler. He uh, calculated that more than half of the Pentagon budget goes to contractors, not to the troops. And it's a wide range. It's the old guard, the big five, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, um, and RTX, Raytheon. Uh, they get about a third of what the Pentagon hands out every year. Lockheed Martin in some years gets more contracts, more of our tax money than the State Department does. But then you've got the up and coming companies, the Palantirs, Anduril. I don't know why they want to name their companies after things in Lord of the Rings, but they do, which makes a lot of Lord of the Rings people really outraged, actual fans. But anyway, SpaceX, of course, which just did an initial public offering that's allegedly going to make Elon Musk a trillionaire. So there's sequencing because the existing programs are locked down. So Lockheed Martin has the F-35, and they make submarine launch ballistic missiles. Northrop Grumman's making the new ICBM and the new bomber. Raytheon makes all manner of missiles and missile defense technologies. Boeing, despite screwing up almost everything it's done the last 10 years, is building the new fighter plane. General Dynamics makes tanks and also nuclear armed submarines. So that money's already flowing. The money to the tech companies, the deals have been made. Anduril's going to get up to $20 billion to make high-tech goggles for the Army. Now, it could be less, it could be more. It'll be spent over time. So if you looked at a list today of who the big contractors are, the tech firms would look a bit low because the commitments have been made, but the money's not flowing yet. But their idea is they want to be the new big companies on the block. And it may not be necessary unless we stop this, because basically something like Golden Dome is so much money, they can take care of all of them. The old companies will make the hardware, new companies do the software and targeting, and they'll all get even richer. But there's an unnecessary nuclear buildup. There's Golden Dome. Unless we have a strategy that says that's defensive, that's not go anywhere, fight any battle, then of course you have to spend on logistics, transport, ships to get people there, an intervention strategy. You want aircraft carriers, which are like mobile, air bases. So a lot of this is linked into a strategy that has failed. I don't think anybody can really honestly say that the wars of this century have accomplished anything positive for people in America, much less the countries that have been destroyed as part of that. And yet you have Senator Wicker talking about a generational investment for peace through strength. What peace is he talking about? And what strength? We're weakening our country and destroying large parts of the world, and we're undermining the basis of our society, of what a good society should be, of what a democracy should be, in the name of these myths that have been proven wrong so many times before. So part of it is because people are getting rich and they're lying about it. Part of it is people have attached to these myths that America is an exceptional nation. If we don't dominate the world, China will. More is always better when it comes to defense. It's like an insurance policy and so forth. But in fact, spending more is provocative. It leads to more wars. And defense really should be about well-being of the American people, which isn't just about building gadgets. It's got to be about healthcare and education. It's got to be about building a culture where we embrace each other, whatever our background, whatever our religion, whatever our beliefs, not so hatred and division to distract us from our true problem. So it's a big issue, but these companies are on the receiving end, and the tech companies are much more willing to go all in on the culture wars, say all kinds of outrageous things, and of course they don't care about us because they're going to up themselves to a computer and live forever. They're going to colonize space. Well, just don't bring me with you. That's all I ask. So it's to some degree, it's not just about the budget. It's a struggle for our humanity and for what kind of country and what kind of world we want to build, which is why I think more people are engaging in this fight, because it's not optional. It's not an accounting problem.
Yeah, amen to that, Bill. Thank you. And I guess I want folks to take away the point when we're increasing the Pentagon budget, the war budget, what we're really doing is increasing the profits for CEOs and shareholders and all of these corporations, like the big five, but also the emerging tech ones that are kind of masquerading as like software startups, but they're really selling weapons and surveillance technology and all this deadly equipment. That is what we are funding. So on that note, Lindsay, can you talk through some of the trade-offs and explain what we could fund with this proposed $500 billion increase instead of funding the Pentagon?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, $500 billion is so much money. Um, it's so much money. Like I can remember when the entire, I think I've probably all of us speaking on this call can remember when the entire military budget was $500 billion. So it wasn't that long ago. We're talking about a huge amount of money, and it's a huge amount of money to the rest of the budget too. Um, so one thing is they're kind of saying like, oh, don't worry, like some of this money that we're asking for, this huge increase is just one time. It's just this time only. But like I said before, that's not what happens. In reality, they always ask for we'd like to keep it. We'd like to we'd like to keep it where it is. We'd like it to go higher. And so we should absolutely be skeptical and not believe that this would be just a one-time thing. Um, so um so 1 year versus forever, we've learned that that's never true. In fact, one of the reasons that some Republicans, Senator Mitch McConnell and Senator Susan Collins, have objected to possibly passing this reconciliation bill is that they would like it to be long-term higher for the Pentagon budget. So we know that that's a factor, but I'll just take them at their word for the sake of the argument to say like, okay, if we took this money, and even if some of it is only one time, what could we do with $500 billion? So first of all, we could reverse the cuts from the big bad bill. So if we took back the Medicaid cuts from that, put millions of people back on Medicaid who would otherwise lose it. If we put back the SNAP food stamps cuts and save the millions of people who would otherwise lose significant parts or all of their food stamps. And then if we extend the Obamacare subsidies, because another thing that happened during the past year is that people who were getting healthcare subsidies to help them afford health insurance through the Affordable Care Act lost big parts of those subsidies. So if we extend that, we put all of that together, that's almost $150 billion. That's the part of the Pentagon increase that they're saying is forever. So let's take that back. Let's fix those things forever instead of giving it to the Pentagon forever. That's part one. Now, the other part is the 350 billion that they're saying is just a one-time thing. So let's just, for the sake of argument, take them at their word. Let's say it's a one-time thing. The things that we could do with that are we could erase medical debt. Medical debt in this country is $220 billion. We could erase all of it one time for 220 billion. And then add on to that private student debt, which is a little under $150 billion. And that is the debt that's the worst for, as people who are maybe student borrowers, current or former, may know, it's the worst kind of debt to have because it tends to be higher interest rate than the federal student debt. We could erase all of that. And so all of that would add up to just a little over $350 billion. And I would like to say, why aren't we really talking about this? Like, why aren't we, not just as an argument, not just as like oh, I'm making a rhetorical statement about how this is too much money, but why aren't we talking about really doing those things instead of giving the money to the Pentagon for giveaways to contractors that Bill talked about, who have warped visions of Lord of the Rings? Like, why aren't we giving the money to ourselves, right? Medical debt is a huge cause of bankruptcy for people. Student debt is a huge burden, especially for younger people who've had to pay more for their educations. So we should really seriously be talking about doing some of these things instead of putting the money into the Pentagon in all of the wasteful ways that Bill talked about. Um, and that's just for starters. And then after that, that just gets us back to $1 trillion military budget. So then after that, we can actually talk about getting to a reasonable military budget, and with additional cuts, and think about all the things we could do with all of that money. because this has been a problem for longer than just right now. It's just that right now we're facing the most extreme version of it that we've ever faced.
Thanks, Lindsay. And then a follow-up question real quick is, can you talk about how much does the average taxpayer spend on war?
Yes. So every year we put out a tax receipt at tax time in April to show people where their tax dollars are going. And so our most recent tax receipt is actually for 2025. So it's not even telling you about the 1 trillion yet. It's not even telling you about the 1.5 trillion. This is what it was before. This is how bad it already was. And what we found is that the average taxpayer was paying over $4,000 for weapons and war in 2025. So if you think of what happens if it goes up to 1.5 trillion, it's going to be a huge increase to that. And, if you think about what that means to people's budgets, it's a huge amount, right? Most of us don't, it's bigger than the average mortgage. It's bigger than what a lot of people are paying for other necessities. So giving any of that back in any form, whether it be through social programs or, just giving it directly back to people, giving that back can make a huge difference in people's lives.
Thanks, Lindsay. And yeah, I want folks to also to walk away with, budgets are moral documents. So if we're spending over half of our entire federal budget directly to weapons and war and death, and less every day or every year on housing, on healthcare, on infrastructure, on clean water, then what does that say about our morals? Like, just sit with that.
That's right.
Um,
And to
all
bring
right.
it back to the contractors, out of that
Yeah.
4,000, almost half of it, $1,800 was going to Pentagon contractors.
Yeah, of your tax dollars.
That's
Yep.
right.
Thanks. Okay, one final question, and then I will open it up to the audience. Savannah, so we heard about how much the war budget cost the taxpayers and its failure to invest in service members, veterans, and the general public. What efforts have there been to fight back? Are there any upcoming efforts that we should be tracking?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I was just noticing, I'm so thankful that so many folks are still on the call because this is the part where it's like, what can you do? Where can we go from here? And there, we actually have a higher number of webinar attendees on right now than even when we started, which is like a record for webinars. It's great. Um, yes, we are in a really essential moment, and by moment, I actually don't mean like a broad swath of time, although that's true, but like truly the next month, which is why it's perfect timing to be having this call right now, for us to take action. So we are at the exact sweet spot of the year, maybe for better or for worse, where a lot of these budget decisions are being made. We have at least two, possibly more than that, specific votes that we can be weighing in on that if more members of Congress are opposing basically the war machine on those votes, it will send a really, really significant signal of opposition and actually, I think, really could impact the way that budget negotiations go for our federal budget throughout the end of the year. The two big things that I would say watch most imminently. On Wednesday, all members of the Appropriations Committee are going to have an opportunity to possibly take two votes. It sounds like there may be appetite for there to be a challenge to the Pentagon top line, so cutting a specific dollar amount in the same way we just saw a few weeks ago with the House Armed Services Committee and Senate Armed Services Committee. Can't overstate how unprecedented it is to have this many bites at the apple of resisting this budget. Like we should be using all of them. So people who are interested in engaging in that in any way, we need to drum up as much support for efforts to cut the top line budget and just get in the way, oppose the budget wholesale. So when it goes out of committee, basically you don't have to be a policy expert or a person who retains every piece of information we had on this webinar. We hardly do. I think the thing that's most important to know is members need to be hearing how upset people are about the Pentagon budget, how distressing it is that our taxpayer dollars are being used this way, that we want to see direct cuts to that number. And if those cuts don't go through, I mean, even still, we want that budget absolutely blocked. So I think we have the ability to communicate that. Anyone specifically, if you have a member of Congress that's on the Appropriations Committee, this is the time to communicate with them. But then we will have the full NDAA, which is National Defense Authorization Act. It's the defense policy bill that goes through every year. We expect that we'll have that within a week or two of this appropriations ask. So if you're thinking, what can I do between basically like now and probably like before the July 4th holiday, we're going to have another opportunity for that too. And basically, the most powerful signal that members of Congress could take on our behalf is voting that bill down entirely, saying 1.15, and then the ultimate play for a $1.5 trillion Pentagon budget is just a non-starter by every, metric that we've listed here, and just encouraging as many no votes as possible. And we do anticipate that we're in a place to get them, so it is a very exciting moment, in addition to being a very demoralizing moment because this budget has been requested in the first place. But folks are very aligned. This budget is unpopular, and we do have these really big bites at the apple. Wednesday's vote for appropriations, and then the broader floor vote, which will keep everyone posted on timing, but that should be coming between now and the beginning of July. So time is of the essence. But what you can say in those messages is just if anything hit home for you or anything feels personal to you about why you don't want to see this amount of money, you can articulate that. And then the ask is just I support, as very, very steep, hundreds of billions of dollars cuts to this budget, and I oppose the budget in general because those cuts have not been made. And that's all you have to say. It's very simple. So there are a lot of avenues for engaging. I think we'll continue to see a groundswell of support for these types of efforts, and we're very much a part of it. So every single person adding their commentary and their nudge to the pile is making a really big difference right now. And I see someone said, is there a landing page? There are several. I would hazard a guess that probably most of the organizations on this call have some resources for NDAA. We will make sure that there are, things sent around after the call or after the webinar that include a landing page, maybe a way that you can message on this, some resources that you might be able to link, but we'll get all of that to you as well.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Savannah. And yeah, just to echo that, yeah, we will be sending around a recording of this and some resources afterwards as well. So if you missed anything, no worries. You should get an email with all of it sometime next week, probably. But yeah, thanks, Savannah. Okay, so I know we're coming up a bit on time, but I'll try to get to as many questions. Could we turn the recording off for Q&A?